I'm joined by Climate Council CEO Amanda Mckenzie. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dylan. It's great to be here.
To start us off this afternoon, Amanda, what causes climate change?
Well, climate change is caused from greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases come from the burning of fossil fuels, so things like gas, coal, oil and things like that.
The Earth has been warming and cooling for millions and millions of years. What makes this warming different?
Well, what's different about this is that it's caused by human beings. So it's true that the Earth has changed in climate over many centuries in the past, even more time than that, over millennia. But what's different today is the speed of change. It's happening very fast, and also that it's caused by human beings. So we have put up about 40% more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, and that's what's driving the change.
Is there scientific consensus on man-made climate change?
Yes, there is. Like anything, there's always opinions one side or the other, but the important thing is to look to the scientists because they're the experts in the area, and you find that there's absolute consensus in the scientists of those that publish in the peer-reviewed literature that are respected in the climate science.
What are the global environmental effects we are likely to see from climate change?
Well, one of the most important ones is that extreme weather is getting more frequent and more forceful. So that's important, particularly in the Australian context, where we're the land of drought and flooding rain. So we have always experienced heat waves and intense bushfires and things like that. But heat waves are becoming hotter, they're lasting longer, they're happening more often, and bushfire conditions are becoming worse. So these are the things that we need to be aware of in Australia, and also prevent it getting worse by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
What effects will climate change have on the world as a whole?
Yeah, well, as a world as a whole, temperature has already increased by 1 degree, and if we continue to emit greenhouse gases in the way that we are, it will continue to rise. And the projection is by the end of the century we could be at a rise of 4 degrees in temperature. Now, 4 degrees doesn't necessarily sound like much, but it is, because if you look at an ice age to a warming period, so an ice age is when the world is basically all covered in ice, compared to today where we're in a warming period, that's about 5 degrees of difference. So what we're doing is going in the opposite direction. We're going up in temperature, about 4 degrees by the end of the century. That's very rapid change from a warming period to we don't know what it will be like in the future, but a much hotter period. So it's very worrying, and when you have an increase in the average temperature globally is when you see things like an increase in heat waves in Australia.
When are we likely to see a majority of these effects come into play?
Well, we've already started to see the impacts today. You might have noticed that the last summer in Australia had many extreme temperature records broken, over 156. Last year was the hottest on record, so we're already seeing a shift in the climate here in Australia. But what we'll see is if we fail to deal with the climate change problem, if we continue to burn coal and burn oil at the rates that we are now, putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it'll gradually get worse across this century. So it could get to 4 degrees by the end of the century, which would be catastrophic across the world.
The average summer temperature in Fitzroy Crossing here is about 40 degrees. Does that mean that this will rise in temperature by 4 degrees?
It doesn't quite work like that. We couldn't say that because global temperature has increased that much, that's how much you'd exactly see in Fitzroy Crossing. But you'd expect the average temperature to have increased roughly that much. So basically what you'd see in a summertime would be that you'd get more extremes of heat. So if you've got an average temperature of 40 degrees and you have a couple of days or maybe 3 or 4 days during the summer of 45 degrees now, that might go up to 8 days. And when you get heat wave conditions is when you start to see impacts on, of course, agriculture as well as on human health. People aren't built to deal with extremely hot conditions for many, many days in a row. And when we see heat waves getting longer, it obviously has health impacts.
And here in Fitzroy Crossing, it's really prone through the wet season to have really big floods. Will climate change affect how we see these floods?
Well, rainfall is very interesting because what we know is that rainfall is shifting around the world, but it's not conclusive yet where it will land. So where we think it's going is that in North Western Australia, you're likely to see more rainfall. The other thing we know is that climate change means there's more evaporation globally. If it's hotter, you get more water evaporating. And so the atmosphere has more water in it, so you'd expect to see more extreme rainfall events. So we can't say conclusively yet for an area like Victoria Crossing what we know. We know it will change, and it's likely that you'll get more heavy downpours.
Will climate change cause the polar ice caps to eventually melt?
Yes, the North Pole in particular, as well as the Antarctic, are already melting at very rapid rates. And in fact, we've changed the geography of the world already. National Geographic just last week put out something changing their map of the North Pole because so much of that area has actually melted. So, there's significant changes that are already happening, particularly in some of those northern areas.
How high will the seas rise over the next couple of years?
Yeah, well, there's various predictions around that. The best estimates at the moment are that we could see a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century. But if you put together melting of Greenland and the area of West Antarctic, which are both areas that are under threat from climate change, you could get much more significant rises in global in global sea level, so more like 10 metres, which would, again, change the map of the world. The North Pole itself is actually sea ice, so it's not on land, it's in the water, so that won't actually change the sea level. But what it does do is change what that area looks like. So that's it's been like the air conditioner of the world, this cold area at the North Pole. And white ice reflects sunlight, whereas dark ocean absorbs sunlight. So if you have this enormous melting of the northern ice, you actually get more sunlight being absorbed. So the world actually gets hotter. So it's this terrible thing of what's called a feedback loop.
Could we adapt to climate change?
Well, we certainly hope so, because we are experiencing some climate change already. And there is some capacity for us to adapt, of course. The challenge is that people who are the poorest and live in the poorest parts of the world will have the least capacity to adapt and are likely to be the most impacted by climate change. So there is definitely an issue of social justice as part of this problem, particularly because the poorest people have contributed the least to this problem. But in the longer term, if we're looking at changes in temperature of up to 4 degrees by the end of the century, that's the sort of change that we actually can't significantly adapt to. That would mean dramatic changes in human civilization. So what we need to do is prevent climate change getting worse by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and then adapt to some of the changes that we are experiencing while we still can adapt to them.
If climate change is such a big issue, wouldn't have governments already sorted it out?
Well, governments have actually done quite a bit around the world. If you look over the last 5 years, governments have really stepped up to do more. So the United States, for instance, has just put a 30% reduction target on coal by 2030. This is a game-changing move for the whole global environment on climate change. So countries are doing something. They're putting in renewable energy and a whole bunch of other things, but it's not enough so far.
What's the Australian government doing to help prevent climate change going any further?
Well, it's a big point of contention in the Australian political debate what to do about climate change. So both of the major parties accept that climate change is happening and we need to do something about it, but they have significant differences about how they think we should address it. So the Labor Party obviously put in place a carbon tax, and the idea there is to put a price on pollution so that you can drive it down. It's a disincentive to pollute, if you like. The coalition is opposed to that policy and has proposed something different called a direct action policy. We haven't seen all the details of what that looks like yet, but it looks like that will be revealed in coming months.
Is climate change too late to fix?
I don't believe so. I think that it's a huge challenge. It's a huge global challenge and challenge for Australia. But I think that what the science tells us is if we act quickly and if we act together, we can solve it. But it requires all of us to take it very seriously, and it will require significant changes in the way that we use energy. So we need to reduce energy overall, but then we also need to use it smarter. So we need to be using it from sources that are renewable, like solar and like wind. And then if we're going to use things like coal-fired power, we need to find a way that that cannot pollute. So we can't have coal-fired generators in the way that they are now, spewing CO2 into the atmosphere. We either need to capture those emissions and bury them underground, which is what some people have suggested, or we need to reduce the amount of burning of fossil fuels that we're doing.
And what can we all do to help stop climate change on a household basis?
Yeah. Well, everyone has an important role to play, and all of us can be reducing our impact on the earth in our own way, whether that's using less energy or other things around our house. But I think that the most important thing that we each have is our voice. And I think that it's important that we're communicating to leaders in our community, whether it's the local council, the state government, the federal government, whether it's local businesses, whether it's the local school, because when we work together, we can be really very effective. And it can be sometimes a bit disheartening to be doing it on your own, but when you're working with others, and whether you're encouraging and pushing other groups and leaders in the community to act, that's where we can be most effective.
And today, well, I'd say today, as in the day we recorded this interview, there was a brand new report released by the Climate Council talking about Australia's energy future. Could you give us a bit of a explanation on this report?
Sure. So the report that came out today was looking at Australia's electricity sector. And what we found was that our coal-fired generating fleet, which is the lion's share of our electricity generation, is ageing, it's inefficient, and it's unprepared for the future. So we have some very old coal-fired power stations, and they're actually more polluting than many of the power stations in places like China or the United States. So we're a bit behind the eight ball in terms of our energy technology. But what that does is say that there's a big opportunity. We're going to have to retire or replace a lot of that energy, those energy systems in the coming decades, and we can think about how we do that in a smart way. And we know that renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper. We're the sunniest country in the world. We're one of the windiest. We have great opportunities to utilise those natural resources to generate energy in a way that doesn't cause climate change, and but still provides us with reliable, safe energy.
So why aren't energy companies moving to create this more sustainable and an energy source that will be there in the future for a very long time?
Well, some energy companies are investing in renewables, and in fact, renewable investment is now on par with fossil fuel investment. So it is growing really substantially around the world. But that said, energy companies in Australia are still dependent on fossil fuels, and that's their business model. So I think that it's if you're sort of used to doing things a certain way, it can be hard to change, and you've got a certain amount of investment already in that basket. So as consumers, we can do a lot to encourage electricity companies to do more to be protecting the future of Australia.